No one noticed him at first, and that was exactly the point. Before the story unfolds, pause for a moment and comment where you are watching from, then subscribe to the channel, because what follows is not about money, but about humanity. Jonathan Hale had crossed oceans to disappear, not because he lacked wealth, but because he had too much of it. In America, his name moved markets, bent boardrooms, and summoned private jets without effort. In the Philippines, he arrived with worn sandals, a faded shirt, and a silence that felt heavier than any fortune. He had told no one who he truly was, not his staff, not his pilot, not even the local fixer who dropped him near a crowded street at sunrise. Jonathan wanted truth unfiltered by privilege. He wanted to know who people were when there was nothing to gain. The experiment was simple in theory and dangerous in reality. Live as a poor man. Ask for nothing. Observe everything. He believed wealth had distorted his understanding of kindness. What he did not expect was how quickly the illusion of control would shatter, or how one ordinary act from a stranger would expose the lie he had been living for decades. Jonathan's first night broke him faster than he anticipated. Hunger is different when it cannot be solved with a phone call or credit card. It becomes louder, more personal, and deeply humiliating. He slept sitting upright near a closed shop, listening to distant laughter and engines passing like reminders of lives still moving forward. By morning, the confidence that once defined him felt absurd. He had memorized spreadsheets showing global poverty, donated millions to charities, and spoken on panels about economic inequality. None of it prepared him for the feeling of being invisible. He tried to convince himself this discomfort was necessary, that data always required immersion. But when his stomach cramped and his throat burned from thirst, theory dissolved. He stood near a roadside, unsure whether to beg or remain silent. Pride argued loudly, but desperation whispered more convincingly. Jonathan realized the test was no longer about others. It was about whether he could endure the reality he had only ever studied from a distance. The city moved around him without pause. People passed, eyes forward, each carrying burdens he could not see. Then, unexpectedly, someone stopped. The woman did not look wealthy. Her clothes were clean but simple, her hands rough with work, her eyes alert but tired. She noticed Jonathan not with pity, but with curiosity. She asked if he was sick. The question caught him off guard because it assumed concern without obligation. He shook his head and said he was just tired. She studied him briefly, then reached into a small plastic bag and handed him a piece of bread. Jonathan hesitated, instinctively calculating value, cost, exchange. She waited, unbothered by his pause. When he finally accepted, she smiled softly and sat beside him. She did not ask his name. She did not ask his story. She simply said people needed food before explanations. Jonathan felt something tighten in his chest, an unfamiliar discomfort that had nothing to do with hunger. The bread was warm, clearly meant for her own meal. When he asked why she helped him, she shrugged and said someone once helped her when she had nothing. That was all. No sermon. No moral speech. Just a truth passed quietly from one stranger to another. Her name was Maria. She sold fruit near the bus terminal and earned just enough to feed her family each day. Jonathan listened as she spoke about her children, her aging mother, and the daily calculations she made to survive. Every sentence carried weight, not complaint. He wanted to tell her who he was, to explain the experiment, to justify his presence. Instead, he stayed silent, realizing that revealing himself would ruin the honesty of the moment. Maria finished her bread, stood up, and pressed a bottle of water into his hand. He tried to refuse, insisting she needed it more. She shook her head and said kindness loses meaning when rationed by fear. Those words followed him long after she walked away. Jonathan sat alone again, but something fundamental had shifted. The world no longer felt indifferent. It felt layered, complex, and quietly generous in places he had never looked. That single interaction disrupted his assumptions more than any report he had ever commissioned. For the first time, he wondered whether wealth had not only insulated him from hardship, but also from understanding grace. Jonathan stayed in the city for weeks, maintaining the illusion, observing patterns, testing his resilience. Some days were harsh, others surprisingly gentle. He learned which streets offered shade, which vendors ignored him, which smiled. He noticed that help often came from those with the least, while indifference came from those rushing toward abundance. The contrast unsettled him. Maria occasionally passed by, always acknowledging him with a nod, sometimes leaving fruit when she could. She never asked for thanks. Jonathan kept a small notebook, recording moments that challenged his worldview. A tricycle driver who shared change. A child who offered half a candy. A shop owner who allowed him to sit without buying anything. None of these acts were dramatic. That was their power. They were ordinary, unrecorded, and deeply human. Jonathan realized he had spent years funding grand gestures, while overlooking the quiet economies of kindness sustaining communities daily. The experiment had stopped being observational. It had become transformational. He no longer felt like an outsider studying poverty. He felt like a participant in a shared vulnerability. And with that came a responsibility he could no longer ignore. The moment Jonathan decided to reveal himself was not planned. It happened on a rainy afternoon when Maria arrived soaked, carrying less fruit than usual. She admitted business had been slow, but still insisted he eat. Something inside him broke. He told her everything, slowly, carefully, expecting disbelief or anger. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When he finished, silence stretched between them. Jonathan braced himself for judgment. Instead, Maria laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine surprise. She said she suspected he was different, not because of his clothes, but because of how he listened. She did not scold him for deception. She did not praise him for generosity. She simply said money could leave or stay, but character always walked beside a person. Jonathan asked if she felt used. She shook her head and said intention mattered more than secrecy. Then she asked one question that stayed with him forever. What would he do next, now that he knew? There was no accusation in her voice, only expectation. Jonathan returned to America changed, but restless. His wealth felt heavier, more complicated. Board meetings blurred. Profits rang hollow. He replayed Maria's question endlessly. Eventually he acted. Not with announcements or press releases, but with structural changes. He redirected funds toward community-led initiatives, prioritizing dignity over optics. He created programs that trusted local decision-making rather than imposing external solutions. In the Philippines, he quietly funded cooperatives, education, and healthcare access, ensuring Maria's community benefited without turning her into a symbol. He never named buildings after himself. He never sought recognition. He returned once, anonymously, and saw Maria thriving, her children in school, her stall expanded. She recognized him immediately. They spoke briefly. No gratitude was exchanged. None was needed. Jonathan understood then that the experiment had succeeded not because he endured poverty, but because he allowed himself to be changed by it. The first person who helped him had not shocked him because she was kind. She shocked him because she reminded him of who he had forgotten how to be. Years later, Jonathan spoke less publicly and listened more privately. He declined awards and avoided interviews. When asked why, he said impact did not require applause. The story of his time in the Philippines lived quietly within him, shaping decisions unseen by the world. He often recalled the warmth of that bread, the simplicity of Maria's words, and the humility of needing help without conditions. Those memories guided him more reliably than any consultant ever had. Jonathan learned that true wealth was not the ability to give, but the willingness to receive without ego. He understood that systems mattered, but so did moments. That change did not always announce itself with revolution, but arrived softly, carried by ordinary people doing extraordinary things without knowing it. The billionaire who lived as a poor man returned richer in ways no balance sheet could measure. And the woman who helped him first never knew she altered the trajectory of a life that once believed money was the greatest force on earth. In reality, it had always been human connection. Jonathan never told this story in full, but its consequences unfolded slowly across his life. He began measuring success differently, not by expansion, but by alignment. Each investment was filtered through a single question he carried quietly. Does this preserve dignity? The memory of being unseen haunted him more than hunger ever did. He remembered how easily people passed him by, not cruelly but automatically, and how quickly that could happen to anyone. It reshaped how he treated employees, partners, and strangers. He listened longer. He interrupted less. He stopped assuming competence belonged only to credentials. In meetings, he found himself advocating for patience, reminding others that people often needed stability before productivity. Some executives resisted. Others adapted. Jonathan accepted that transformation was uneven. The lesson from the Philippines was not about perfection, but intention sustained over time. He funded programs anonymously, but also showed up in ordinary ways, volunteering without cameras, attending community meetings as a listener. The disguise he once wore physically had become internal. He no longer needed to appear powerful to feel secure. The shock had settled into clarity, and clarity into purpose. Maria, meanwhile, continued her life without fanfare. She never told neighbors about Jonathan's revelation, never claimed credit for his change. Her days were still long, her challenges real, but her sense of self remained intact. She taught her children that helping someone did not require understanding their story, only recognizing their humanity. That lesson spread quietly through her household. When her eldest son asked why she helped strangers when resources were scarce, she explained that generosity was not measured by surplus, but by choice. That philosophy guided her family decisions. When floods came, they shared shelter. When work was scarce, they shared food. Jonathan's influence in her life was indirect, almost invisible. He became a reminder that people were more than appearances. She often wondered where he was, whether he kept his word to himself. But she never worried. Some truths did not require monitoring. The act of helping him had not been transactional. It had been complete in the moment. That completeness was what made it powerful, enduring, and free from regret. Time passed, and the world changed in predictable and unpredictable ways. Economic cycles rose and fell. Crises emerged. Jonathan responded differently than before. Instead of reacting with control, he responded with trust. He funded local leadership during disasters, believing those closest to problems understood them best. Critics accused him of being naive. He accepted that risk. He had learned that certainty was often an illusion maintained by distance. The Philippines remained a quiet reference point in his mind. Whenever doubt crept in, he recalled the simplicity of that first exchange. Bread offered without expectation. Help given without calculation. It reminded him that resilience often lived outside institutions. His companies remained profitable, but less aggressive. He prioritized sustainability over speed, retention over extraction. Shareholders adjusted. Some left. Others stayed, recognizing a long-term vision rooted in stability. Jonathan stopped chasing growth for its own sake. He pursued coherence instead. The billionaire who once believed he needed to test the world had realized the world had tested him, and he had been changed by passing through it honestly. Jonathan eventually established a foundation, structured differently from traditional models. It did not lead with solutions, but with questions. Communities defined success on their own terms. Metrics existed, but they followed meaning, not the other way around. This approach frustrated those accustomed to control. Jonathan welcomed the discomfort. He remembered how it felt to relinquish power, to exist without leverage, to depend on kindness. That memory anchored his leadership. He rejected narratives that portrayed poverty as failure. Instead, he framed it as a condition shaped by systems, history, and circumstance. His language shifted, and so did the culture around him. Employees noticed. Partners adapted. Slowly, influence followed example. Jonathan never spoke publicly about Maria, but her presence lived in every decision. She represented a standard he measured himself against, not of charity, but of humanity. He knew he would never fully repay what he received that morning. The bread had fed him briefly. The lesson had fed him for life. That imbalance was acceptable. Some debts were meant to remain open, guiding behavior rather than demanding closure. Years later, Jonathan found himself once again walking unfamiliar streets, though this time without disguise. He traveled quietly, choosing places where his name meant nothing. In each city, he observed how people treated one another when no one was watching. He noticed similarities across cultures. Kindness emerged in small, consistent gestures. It rarely announced itself. He stopped seeking extraordinary stories and began honoring ordinary ones. The experiment in the Philippines had ended, but its methodology remained. Listen first. Assume less. Intervene only when invited. Jonathan understood that wealth created noise and silence created insight. He chose silence more often. When asked what had changed him, he spoke vaguely, crediting time and experience. Some truths felt diminished when summarized. The reality was simpler and deeper. He had once believed power revealed character. He learned instead that vulnerability revealed truth. Living as a poor man had not stripped him of identity. It had stripped away illusion. What remained was responsibility, not to fix everything, but to act consistently with what he now understood. Maria aged gracefully, her strength steady, her influence subtle but persistent. Her children grew into adults shaped by quiet values rather than grand speeches. They remembered how their mother treated people, not what she owned. One became a teacher, another a small business owner, another worked in community health. Each carried forward the lesson learned without ceremony. Maria never traveled far, but her impact extended beyond geography. The kindness she showed Jonathan rippled outward in ways neither of them could measure. She remained skeptical of praise, deflecting compliments with humor. To her, helping had never been exceptional. It was simply part of living among others. She believed the world did not change through declarations, but through repetition. Do the right thing often enough, and it becomes culture. That belief sustained her through hardship and uncertainty. When asked once if she regretted giving away her last piece of bread, she laughed. Hunger passed. Character stayed. The moment had already given her more than it took. That understanding anchored her long after Jonathan's story faded from memory. Jonathan's health eventually slowed him. He spent more time reflecting, less time expanding. He organized his affairs carefully, ensuring continuity without control. In his private journal, he wrote often about the Philippines, though never naming specifics. He described sensations rather than events. The weight of hunger, the relief of help, the humility of receiving. Those pages were not for publication. They were reminders. When advisors pushed for legacy projects, he declined monuments. He preferred systems that outlived him quietly. Jonathan accepted mortality without panic. He felt complete, not because he had achieved everything, but because he had aligned his actions with his understanding. The shock he once experienced had softened into gratitude. He no longer felt compelled to prove anything. When asked near the end what lesson mattered most, he answered simply, "Listen when someone helps you. They're teaching you something about yourself." That sentence captured what years of wealth never had. The billionaire who once pretended to be poor had learned that humility was not an act, but a posture sustained through choice. News of Jonathan's passing traveled quickly through financial circles and quietly through the communities he had touched. There were tributes, articles, summaries of achievements. None captured the essence of his transformation. Maria heard about his death through a passing comment, years after their meeting. She paused, said a brief prayer, and returned to her work. She felt sadness, but also peace. People entered and exited life continually. What mattered was how they moved through it. Jonathan had moved well in the end. She did not attend any ceremonies. Her connection to him had never required acknowledgement. The moment they shared belonged to both of them equally. It remained intact, unclaimed by narratives or legacy. That was enough. The first person who helped him had never sought recognition, and that purity preserved the truth of the story. The shock had never been about who helped him. It had been about realizing how easily help could come, and how rarely it was truly seen. The story survived not as a headline, but as an undercurrent. It appeared in decisions made quietly, in policies shaped with restraint, in people empowered without spectacle. Jonathan's influence did not vanish. It diffused. That diffusion was intentional. He had learned that concentrated power distorted outcomes. Distributed trust strengthened them. The Philippines remained a symbolic origin, not a focus. The lesson applied everywhere. Humanity did not change by location. It revealed itself through behavior. The experiment had ended, but the practice continued through others who adopted similar humility. Some knew the origin. Most did not. That anonymity honored the spirit of the act. Jonathan had once believed wealth could buy understanding. He learned it could only create distance. Closing that distance required stepping down, not rising above. The poor man he once pretended to be had taught the billionaire how to live honestly. That reversal defined the remainder of his life. It stood as quiet evidence that transformation did not require suffering, only openness to being changed by unexpected kindness. Maria continued to help strangers when she could, not because of philosophy but habit. She believed goodness was strengthened through use. Her community changed incrementally, supported by structures Jonathan helped enable, but shaped by local effort. She remained part of that fabric, neither elevated nor diminished by history. When people asked why she was trusted, she said trust was built by consistency, not explanation. Her life remained modest. Her influence remained deep. Jonathan's memory occasionally surfaced in her thoughts, usually accompanied by a smile. He had arrived as a test and left as a student. That reversal amused her. The world often confused roles, but truth corrected them quietly. She taught her grandchildren that everyone carried a story invisible at first glance. Treat them accordingly. That lesson outlived both of them, passed forward without attribution. It did not belong to Jonathan or Maria. It belonged to the moment they shared and the choices that followed. That was enough to justify everything that came after. The experiment was never replicated exactly. It did not need to be. Its value lay not in imitation, but in implication. What would happen if more people allowed themselves to be helped without control? What would change if generosity was received as seriously as it was given? Jonathan's life offered one answer. Maria's offered another. Both pointed toward the same truth. Wealth did not determine worth. Circumstance did not define character. The shock was not in discovering kindness among the poor. The shock was realizing how often it went unnoticed by those with power. Jonathan had noticed too late, but not too late to change. That timing mattered. It suggested redemption was not about beginnings, but responses. The first person who helped him had altered his trajectory simply by acting as herself. That was the power of uncalculated kindness. It required no permission and left no receipt. It endured precisely because it asked for nothing in return. In the end, the story did not belong to the billionaire or the woman who helped him. It belonged to anyone willing to pause long enough to see another person clearly. Jonathan Hale lived as a poor man and was shocked by who helped him first, but the deeper revelation came later. He learned that help did not diminish the giver or the receiver. It connected them. That connection outlasted wealth, geography, and time. The Philippines was where the illusion broke, but the lesson applied everywhere. The first hand extended to him carried no agenda, only humanity. That simplicity dismantled decades of assumption. The billionaire returned to his world changed, not because he had seen poverty, but because he had been seen within it. Maria returned to her life unchanged in principle, because she had always lived that way. The contrast defined the story's power. One needed transformation. The other needed nothing at all. That difference explained everything.